Here we have the 2019 AP Macroeconomics Free Response Question Set 2. Let's see what it has in store for us. If we scroll down here. Now the first question, it's super huge, but we can tackle this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We got 5 parts to the first question. Let's just zoom on in and let's begin. Hopefully you already attempted this problem, and maybe you can check your answers alongside of me, or if you just want to see me run through it, that's fine as well. This says, assume the economy of Artland is currently operating above full employment. Okay, so above full employment, we're out of equilibrium, and if we're operating above full employment, that's going to be called inflationary gap. So I know that's what we're going to be drawing. It says draw a correctly labeled graph, short run, long run, aggregate demand. Label each of the following current equilibrium. All right, so let's tackle part A. Oops, that's not it. There we go. So what do we got? Make sure to write out your X and Y axis, except for GDP. You can abbreviate. You don't have to write gross domestic product. Our GDP is fine for that. Let's pick another color. Bam! It said show the short run. Let's just label that 1. It said show the aggregate demand. 1. It said show the current price level, and you remember that short run plus aggregate demand, that's going to equal the current, so where we currently are in this moment in time. And I believe it said label Y1. Now there's the current, and we're operating in a inflationary gap, which means that Y1 is going to be greater than YF. That means that's the long run aggregate supply. So let's see if I'm missing anything here. It says the current equilibrium, Y1P01, did that. Full employment output labeled as YF. I did that as well. Boom, that wasn't too rough. And now it says assume the central bank and the government do not take any policy actions to close the output gap, which means that there's no fiscal policy and no monetary policy. Right, so we're just doing nothing. On your graph in part A, show how the economy automatically adjusts in the long run and label a new equilibrium, PL2. So we're going to draw on the same graph, and then we're going to explain off to the side. Okay. Let's just choose yellow because we're in a inflationary gap, which means, of course, there has been inflation. And with inflation comes higher prices, including wages. So maybe I can write that off to the side. Or that's going to be, let me write my explanation first, right? That was what, B? It was B2, I believe. Something like that. So inflationary gaps. They lead to higher prices and wages, and that wages one is kind of what they're looking for too. Higher wages, right? It's a chain reaction. Wages lead to a decrease in the short run aggregate supply. They lead to a decrease in the aggregate supply because it is now costing those producers more money to make their good. So we're going to decrease that SRAS. And usually whenever we're out of equilibrium and it just tells you to show the change, I like to just show that best case scenario. Right? Like what's really supposed to happen. Or the ultimate goal, right? The ultimate goal is to get back to this equilibrium, this long run equilibrium there. We'll label that SRAS2. Let's see if it wants us to make a new price level. On your graph, show how the economy, price level 2, yeah. So we want to show what the price level, then we want to explain, which that was B2, which I explained, but we do need to label if it tells us to label PL2. Bam. That's fun. C. Alternatively, suppose the government wants to close the output gap using fiscal policy. Okay, identify a fiscal policy action the government can implement. And how will the fiscal policy change the unemployment rate, the natural rate of unemployment? In closing the output gap, will the automatic adjustment identified produce a higher or lower or same price compared? So while we don't have to draw a graph, I'm gonna sketch a very rough graph here off to the side. Currently we're like this, and it's saying what if we take some fiscal policy action to reduce our aggregate demand. So now we're here. I'm going to reference this graph as we go along. So there are two big ways that the government can achieve this decrease in aggregate demand. One of them is that we can decrease government spending. And the other way is we can raise taxes. Because if the government raises taxes, that more or less means that there's less money in the pockets of consumers. And if the consumers have less money, they will spend less. So only one of these is fine. I believe the next question was what happens to unemployment and the natural rate of unemployment. So check this out. Currently, we were here at Y1. And then we moved to the left to get to this equilibrium. And remember, this is GDP. GDP is linked to unemployment, which means if we move to the left, unemployment is going up, and if we move to the right, unemployment is going down. So by decreasing this GDP, we are actually going to be increasing the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate will increase. And I think the second part to that second question is kind of a curveball. It says what's going to happen to the natural rate of unemployment. And if you remember, the natural rate was structural plus frictional equals natural. So structural, if you remember, these are people whose skills are no longer in demand. And frictional are people who are moving from job to job. Now the reason they are called natural is because there's a couple of reasons. One is that natural, meaning that these will always exist, Even if we were in this utopian society, you're still going to have people changing jobs and moving from job to job, right? There's no real way to get rid of this. And in terms of structural, this has to do with innovation, technological innovation. The only way to stop this type of employment is to stop all technological advancements. So there is no way to stop these. And it's kind of interesting if you look at a graph of the natural rate of unemployment throughout time, it's relatively the same. So let's say here's our graph. We got GDP, and we got time over here. So you know the business cycle, right? Sometimes the economy does really well, and then sometimes we have recessions and depressions and so on and so forth. And we gradually, we go up, and our peaks are a little higher, our troughs are a little lower. If you look at the unemployment in terms of this, right? Unemployment's very low, then unemployment gets very high. Unemployment gets really low, unemployment gets really high. But the natural rate of unemployment, it looks something like this. It's more steady, it's more even, and the reason being is that because these are natural and because we can't stop these, nothing is really going to affect these as much. It's going to be harder to affect structural and frictional unemployment. It's going to be hard to change the natural rate of unemployment. And kind of the rule of thumb that I go by is that raising taxes and government spending is not enough to change our natural rate of unemployment. Therefore, for this answer, the natural rate of unemployment will not change. And then the very last one, I think it said the price level. Describe what happens to the price level. Let's go back and check really quick. Unemployment rate in the closing output. Will the automatic adjustment identified in part B1, produce a higher, a lower, or the same price level compared to the fiscal policy? So we're comparing what happened in B1 to what's happening in C1. So what happened in B1? B1 said on your graph, show how the economy adjusts to the long run. Let's go back up to our B1. So in this graph, what happened to the price level? The price level ultimately increased. And in this fiscal policy, the price level, right, if that's 1 and that's 2, the price level ultimately decreased. So in B1 has the higher price level, so it says produce a higher, lower, or the same price level. So so B1 is going to be higher than C1. The price level in B1 is higher than price level in C2. C1. Boom, and I think that's it for the for C. 3 parts to C. Let's move on to D then. This is where it gets kind of in depth, and there's a lot of these connections you have to start making. It says draw a correctly labeled graph of the market for loanable funds. Show the effect of the fiscal policy action identified in part C1 on the equilibrium interest rate. Alrighty, so we're drawing a different graph, and we're gonna have to use this information. Yes, I do have enough room to do this down here. So let's do this as loanable funds. Let's draw this graph right quick. And I would not overthink loanable funds, right? Funds meaning what? Money. Loanable meaning what? This is banks making loans. So this is the money in banks. And we got the interest rate up here. And we got the quantity of loanable funds, right? The amount of money banks have. Quantity of loanable. And there is a supply of money, and there is a demand for money. And for supply, here's kind of banking 101. Where do banks get their money from? Well, usually or typically it's from people or firms, right? So if you put your money in the bank, you are contributing to the supply. Therefore, saving saving your money, putting your money in a bank in this graph is very similar or equal to the supply. If I deposit $10 in my savings account, that's going to contribute to the quantity of loanable funds, because therefore banks can use that money that I am saving and they can lend it out, they can loan it to other people, which is represented right here by this supply, right? It's also savings, which means if you think about it this way, if the interest rate is really high, we're going to want to save. If there's a 20% interest rate, you're going to want to put your money in the bank to capitalize off of that interest rate. And if the interest rate is very low, there's little incentive to put your money in the bank. There's almost, if the interest rate is below zero, what's the difference between just holding your money and putting your money in the bank? You're not going to want to save, or the incentive is not there. So the supply is really savings as well. These two are very almost interchangeable. Maybe they're interchangeable. They're very closely linked. The demand, think about the demand for loans. If the interest rate is really high, we're not going to want to take out a loan because it's just going to cost us more money. And if the interest rate is very low, yeah, sure. The demand is now all of a sudden very high. Let's take out that interest rate. Might as well. Take out that loan. Might as well. So we have the supply and demand of money. And it is saying what might happen to this graph if that fiscal policy action was taken. And remember what happened. The government decreased their spending, or you might have written that the government increased taxes. So if the government decreased their spending, that's going to equate to a shift in this demand. And this is a little similar to the aggregate demand where spending is linked. In this case, the demand is going to be representative of borrowers, which makes a lot of sense, right? If the government is spending more, that means they're borrowing more, which means this demand is going up. In this case, since we wanted to reduce that output gap, we want to spend less, which means we're going to be borrowing less. So by borrowing less, the demand will decrease, and our interest rate will decrease. We can label this interest rate 1. And then what happens to our quantity of loanable funds, Q1? it decreases because we're taking out less loans. We're borrowing less. There is another answer that has to do with supply. You can think of it kind of like how spending is the opposite of saving. So if we're not spending this money, or if the government is not spending this money, let's say every year they're taking out this loan of $1 million, but now all of a sudden they're gonna save it. They're not gonna spend it, which means that $1 million is gonna go back to the supply. So there is an alternative answer where you can say the supply is going to increase because they're not spending. So S2, and you'll see that regardless of whether the supply increases or the demand decreases, the interest rate will decrease. But in this case, the quantity will increase. So either supply or demand shift there will work for an answer. So that is that's part A through E. If we scroll down to question number 2, the market for the foreign exchange market's not going to be on the 2020 test, so we can skip over part 2. And part 3, question number 3, we have a comparative advantage question. It says Sweden and Norway, blah blah blah. 50 food, 30 food, 100 capital goods, 120 capital goods. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the production possibilities curve for Sweden. Okay, so remember that this table is going to be showing maximum, right? It's showing either or. They can either produce 50 food or they can produce 100 capital goods. They cannot do both of these at the same time. So let's go ahead and draw that on a graph. Production possibilities curve here. Let's put food, that's an F. Capital goods. And what, 100 or 50. Now, when in doubt, remember we can draw a curved line or a straight line. A curved line meaning that the factors of production aren't similar or interchangeable. A straight line meaning that the factors of production are interchangeable. This question really doesn't give us that much information. So either curved line or straight line is fine. Just when in doubt, I don't know, make it vague. Like that. And it says we got to label 3 points on this graph. A point that represents an efficient is E, inefficient I, unattainable is U. You got it. Anything on the line, that's a biggie. Anything below the line, that's a big I. And this is unattainable. And a brief note about this unattainable stuff. This is a snapshot in time. This is capturing a second. So currently, in this second snapshot, it is unattainable. However, there are ways that in the future we can eventually grow and expand, through trade and through other stuff, technology. We can eventually expand. So this is Sweden. Let's go ahead and label this just Sweden. Sweet. Easy. Boom. Next. Assume. Sweden moves from producing 20 food, 60 capital goods to producing 30 food, 40 capital goods. What will happen to economic growth? This is, I don't know if I like the wording of this question, but whatever, we'll deal with it. So these are all ratios, right? They're all either ors, right? 20 food or 60 goods, 30 units or 40 goods. Let's just make a ratio to solve this problem, because we might have to show our work on this 2020 test, or all of our work. So what? 20 food, 60 goods. Let's just bring that down to a ratio, right? Divide by 2, or 20. I mean, you know what I'm talking about. One food. What is this? 2, 4, 6. 3 goods. So in this first scenario, Sweden can make one food, or they can make 3 capital goods. And let's say they're changing that, right? They moves from producing this to 30 to 40. Well, hopefully your mental math is just as good as mine, because maybe you can see where this is going. Divide by 30. One food. Divide by 30. I don't know what that is. Maybe some 1 point something. It doesn't even matter. But we're moving from one food and 3 capital goods to only producing one food and 1.3 capital goods. You're just asking which is better. Of course, we want to be producing with the higher numbers, right? We would rather produce 3 capital goods and lose 1 food, as opposed to producing 1.9 capital goods and for the sake of 1 food. We're decreasing. Our economy is decreasing. Our economy is going down. What's the exact question? What will happen to economic growth? Economic growth will decline. Let's go ahead and just write that out to get that point. So part two. Economic growth is declining, or will decline. Is decline. Part D, which country has a comparative advantage? All right, this is the real problem. Which has the comparative advantage in production of capital goods? Explain. Okay, we can do this. I like making a table. Let me just memorize these. 50, 100, 30, 120. 50, 100, 30, 120. Right, this was Sweden. This was, I think, Norway. I like making a what do you call it? Opportunity cost table. And let's do some quick math. Divide by 50. Divide by 50. You can do that. Okay. So for every 1 food, Sweden is giving up 2 capital goods. Let me scroll up just a little bit. Right. So this is food. This is capital goods. Remember the opportunity cost. We're doing the opportunity cost. So underneath the food column, for every 1 food, we're giving up 2 capital goods. And reciprocal. Divide by 30, divide by 30. What is that, 4? Pretty sure that's 4. 3, 6, 9, 10, 11, 20. Yeah, I'm smart. Reciprocal. Boom. There's our opportunity cost table. Comparative advantage in what was it? Food? Production of capital goods. So let's go to the production of capital goods. Boom, 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 boom. And who has the comparative advantage? It's the person with the lower opportunity cost. We would rather have Norway produce these capital goods because they are giving up less food. And in economics is all about conserving resources. So we want to conserve our resources, of course. So Norway has let's write everything out, comparative advantage. In producing capital goods. Now this last part is the doozy one. All right, the hardest for last. It says, based on the table above, identify a specific number of capital goods that could be traded for 10 units of food and be mutually beneficial. Okay, so you remember terms of trade? It's all about ratios. One food for how many capital goods? And I'm starting with food because it gives us food here, 10 units of food. Paint. So 1 unit of food for how many capital goods? Question mark. How many capital goods? And we know the problem, it's kind of a two-step problem because it's asking we want to trade 10 unit of foods. How many capital goods will be traded for 10? So I'm going to start with this basic ratio, and then we'll just multiply by 10 at the very end. So 1 unit of food for how many capital goods? And if I'm searching for how many capital goods, right, I'm going to be looking at the opportunity cost for capital goods, right? We have one food, which means we're looking in this column. And super shortcut is we're just picking a number in between 2 and 4. The why are we doing that? Well, there's a long explanation. If Norway is producing capital goods, that means Sweden is producing food. Sweden, for every 1 food Sweden is producing, they are losing 2 capital goods, right? It's the opportunity cost, but it's easier to visualize if you say they are losing 2 capital goods. If they are losing 2 capital goods, that means they want more than 2 capital goods when they trade. If they are trading and receiving 2 or less capital goods, there's no point to the trade. Now Norway, for every 1 food they could produce, remember they're producing capital goods, but if they were to produce 1 food, they would be losing 4 capital goods, which means they want to lose less. And that's kind of the trickier part. They want to lose less than 4 capital goods. So that's why it's in between 2 and 4. So we pick a number, and you can pick. There are literally 30. There's I guess infinite correct answers on this question. Let's pick 3. It's easy. So 1 food for 3 capital goods. And we got to make sure to upgrade that because the question is asking for 10 food times 10. Boom. 30 capital goods. 31 is an acceptable answer. 32 is an acceptable answer. 33 is an acceptable answer. Those are all will get you the point. So there you go. There's your AP Macroeconomics 2019 Question Set 2 AP College Board. I wonder if I'm allowed to post these online. I guess. I don't know. I don't make them. Well, I'm sure I'll be fine